Thank you, John. We've noted down the various questions. As I expected, your slide 36 with your scope and schedule graph has got, I think, nearly 50% of the questions or whatever, and it's triggered a lot of people. And I remember our first discussion about it, and we'll get to that one in a second, because I find what's most impressive in your answer is that I feel particularly incompetent with regards to IT, given how somebody with your experience manages to estimate scope in such a cool fashion. But we'll come to that. Before that, we've got some other questions. Going back chronologically, because I think it's a very good one. Jack Vincent asked, do you find that people correctly identify their constraints within IT? Do they know where they are?
It's a great question. Hey, Jack, how you doing? It's hit or miss. What I find is that not a lot of people are applying constraint management to IT. So I'm trying to be an emissary and an advocate in that realm. But, people in IT typically think about constraints, and they think about them a lot, but they think about them in the context of how can I make this hardware more efficient? How can I make this software more efficient? They don't think about constraints in terms of their own process so much. So taking Agile as an example, people become painfully aware of constraints when the phenomenon that I described earlier occurs. When the developers aren't the constraint, and they don't have prioritized requirements or stable requirements, then they become painfully aware of constraints. One of the things to drive Agile developers crazy is to have unstable constraints, where in sprint 1 you deliver something, and during sprint 2 the project sponsor says, oh, never mind, we've changed our marketing plan. You can throw away all that stuff you did in the previous sprint because we need you to do something completely different in this one. That's why IT people have less hair.
Okay, Jack commented on your answer as you were speaking, and we completely agree that people must understand that the theory constraints management, it's a lot to do with a capacity blockage, and people tend to use the word constraint for other reasons, which are big problems or something that's blocking them on a particular subject. And we're really looking for capacity constraints, in fact.
Right. In fact, let me respond to Jack's response by acknowledging that there's a difference between a limit and a constraint. And the difference is, a limit is something that means you produce less than you would like to produce, but it's not something that you can necessarily manage. And an example of that is a business rule. A business rule that we're not going to do overtime, or we're not going to ship overnight, or we're not going to give a discount except to our favorite customers. So all those are business rules, and they may impose a limit on the business, but they aren't necessarily something that you can manage production with. So to really get precise about what we're talking about here, ideally the constraint ought to be something that controls the production of an operations of some kind. That's why I use developer as the example of a constraint in an Agile environment.
Okay. Another question. What if demand far exceeds IT capacity?
Yeah, like, does it ever not exceed IT capacity? We're fortunate in the IT field in that a lot of people love what we do, but sometimes you can be overloved. If you have more demand than you can possibly exceed to, then I would invite you to have a look at a book by Eli Schragenheim and a couple of co-authors. It's a recent book. It's entitled, I believe, Throughput Economics. I sometimes get that wrong.
That's right.
I call it by the wrong title, but Throughput Economics. And within it, you'll see them do what I've chosen to call delta analysis. They look at alternatives and compare them from a throughput accounting perspective. And that can be helpful in an IT environment too, if you've got a choice of alternatives that involves revenue producing activities. You can literally look at the IT contribution of IT work. Unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that we do in IT doesn't directly map to what throughput accounting or throughput economics calls a throughput generator. Human resources is an example of a necessary condition that we have to satisfy to have a viable enterprise, but it doesn't generate revenue. So does that mean that you keep cutting back on your HR function? Well, you can cut back and you can economize and you can streamline and so forth, but you don't want to do it to the point that HR becomes your constraint. You know, how does HR become a constraint? You cut it back to the point that they can't help you find viable candidates to replenish your skills buffer. So in the other webinar, I'm going to make a cross-webinar reference here. I go through an example from an appendix in the book that talks about a multitude of other considerations that go into prioritizing IT projects. We haven't talked about it in this webinar, but the concept of strategic planning horizons, I think, is an important one. Horizon number one is your current business. Horizon number two is further into the future. You can think of it as being 1 to 5 years out. And horizon three is 5 to 10 years or even beyond that. If your people, strategic thinkers in the enterprise are planning great and wonderful things in horizons 2 and 3, and your IT people are stuck in horizon 1 because they got all these legacy systems that they're maintaining, then eventually that's going to catch up with you because you're going to get to horizon 2 and not have the IT capabilities that you need. So when looking at a spectrum of potential investments in an IT portfolio, looking at them from a horizons perspective is an important thing to do. It's important also to look at things like the relative maturity of your applications. Some of them may have accumulated enough technical debt that you're paying more to maintain them than you would pay if you simply resolve that debt. And I need to give a shout out to IT developers here, because IT developers deal with technical debt all the time. They don't create it intentionally. I mean, they create it because they're under time or budget pressure and they have to do something that maybe isn't as elegant as they'd like for it to be. But over time, when presented with an opportunity to overcome technical debt by rewriting code or by changing a design or by changing an operations procedure, they'll do it. Unfortunately, there are limits to how much you can do, because dealing with technical debt may be a subtle form of multitasking. You know, you're given a task and you have to go into module XYZ to fix whatever bug there is. And while you're in there, you decide, well, you're going to rewrite the algorithm. If that eliminates technical debt, great, but you know, now you've invested some time in an ancillary activity. And despite those best efforts, technical debt tends to become accumulative, and it's kind of like a snowball rolling downhill. It doesn't get any better, and once it reaches a critical mass. So it may be the case that you actually need within your IT portfolio management to envision projects that do nothing more than resolve technical debt on the critical system, or projects that retire an old system because it wouldn't be affordable or sensible to try to fix what's broken, but it would make more sense to replace it with something new. So accommodating, resolving technical debt in your IT portfolio decisions is another one of, you know, easily a dozen considerations to keep in mind.
Great, thanks. We're coming up to the official end of the time, and of course now all the questions are pouring in. There's just 10 new questions. You just popped it up while you were talking.
I can keep going if you can, Philip.
exactly. So that's what I'm going to suggest. We'll carry on after the scheduled end time, which is in 3 minutes, okay? Because the more you talk, the more questions are coming in, John. So every answer you give generates 3 new questions. So this is
We're
going
not getting closer
exponential.
to the goal then, are
Yeah,
we?
yeah, absolutely. So this is going into crazy places. But let's just carry on because there's some good stuff, some good questions coming in. You've obviously warmed up the room. They were all very silent. I was getting worried for the first 30 minutes, but now it's it's coming out at the speed I can read. Um, you're talking about how to manage your constraints, your IT constraints. What do you do if you've outsourced your IT? Maybe I should say, should you outsource your IT? But I'll ask that one afterwards.
Well, as most people on this call will know, IT outsourcing began with Kodak back in the early 90s, and it has become institutionalized in many organizations, which is great if you're an outsourcer. I actually worked for a company that was an outsourcer, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. What I would suggest, though, is if you have an IT constraint and it lives outside your organization, first thing I would do is have a conversation with that outsourcer about constraint management. Because constraint management for IT is a relatively recent phenomenon, they may simply not know about what's available. So education would be my first suggestion. Hopefully in the course of that opening conversation, then you could steer it towards what's called elevating the constraint. You know, at the outset of this webinar, I said I was going to describe constraint management in my own terms, which I did to try to keep it so that I didn't have to spend 10 minutes on one slide. But if you go back to the original writings on theory of constraints, you'll see that one of the activities is elevating the constraint, which simply means figuring out how to get more capacity. We saw that in the example that I used where the capacity of HT went from, I forget what it was, I think it was 250 to 300. In the case of IT, it might mean that your outsourcer needs to hire more people, or it might mean that they need to train those people so that they have a higher skill level, or equip them with a better tool. All of those actions could be used to elevate the constraint. It's possible if they go crazy that they might elevate the constraint to the point that the constraint moves. And in general, floating constraints are not something that we like to have in constraint management, because as soon as you get the buffer situated, if the constraint floats somewhere else, then the buffer's in the wrong place. But the scenario that I just laid out for you moments ago, one of shifting an external buffer from an IT outsourcer back into something inside your organization, could actually be a good thing, because then it's back under your control and you're managing the constraint. So let's suppose that the IT outsourcer that you've engaged does training for you. And there have been the roadblock on a past project where the project sponsor wanted the project done in 9 months, and you knew that you had to do development for 7 months, but the outsourcer couldn't get the training done in 2 months. They said they needed 4 months total. If you're able to help them elevate that constraint and get it back into a 2-month window, then that means that the constraint is shifting from training by the outside outsourcer back into your organization, where you're managing the constraint on development. So elevate the constraint is my short answer to that question.
Okay. I'm going to abuse of my hosting position to dig on that one just a little bit further. If we go back, as you say, it started in the 90s with Kodak. If we go back 10 years or so, the main management trend with regards to IT was to outsource it, saying, concentrate on your core business. IT is just an ancillary thing on the side, and you don't want to become experts in it. And fairly violently, let's say over the past 5 years, 3 years, things have changed, and we're now talking about how important the digital world is to everybody. You talked about it. So isn't there a strategic preoccupation by not mastering IT in any business today?
that a question for me, Philip?
Yeah.
Well, I think it depends on how important IT is to your organization. So bear with me. I'm going to go back to an early slide. There we go. That's the one I was looking for. I'm recalling this slide because there isn't any universal answer for IT. There's only options I can give you. And what happens in IT is that the pendulum tends to swing too far in one direction and then it swings back. Outsourcing became all the rage for a while, and then people realized that they have to manage their outsourcer. And managing an outsourcer is a different set of skills than managing internal teams. So I wanted to come back to slide 21 here just to recall to everybody's mind that the role that IT plays in your organization can be vastly different from the role it plays in other organizations. So whether IT outsourcing is the right answer for your company or not at a particular point in time is not something that I can answer in the abstract. Yeah.
Okay. Going back up through the questions chronologically, when you were presenting critical chain, there was a question about how can you estimate critical chain, I assume critical chain tasks, in advance in a highly volatile project?
Great question. One of the challenges that we had in a services business is we can't do, the people who are going to perform the task can't always do the estimate. And the reason for that is that the proposal is being presented to the client before people are assigned to do the tasks. So if you don't know who's going to do the task, you can't walk over to Joe's desk and say, Joe or Sally, how long do you think it's going to take you to do this? So what you have to do instead is have some data about how long it has taken you to do comparable tasks in the past. So you can do estimating by analogy. It's even better if you have enough of a database that you can have some metrics to estimate the task for. And to the degree that there's uncertainty on some tasks, you attribute more contingency to them than you would otherwise would. As I said earlier, critical chain, the project plan puts the contingency elsewhere. But in addition to estimating individual tasks, it's also possible to put a capacity buffer into a project plan for IT. Basically a phantom task ahead of the buffer that says, we know there's 30% undiscovered requirements out there, and we're just going to allocate some time to deal with those unforeseen requirements. And we're going to do it by putting that explicitly into the project plan. One of the things you have to be careful of, though, is over padding the project, because the diagram that I showed you of critical chain is a little bit misleading because it implies, let me get back to that slide. It implies that there aren't very many branches. In a real project plan based on critical chain, the critical chain might only be 20% of the tasks. There could be a lot of other branches here that are non-critical paths. And so if you know that you've got 30% requirements that are going to be discovered along the way, adding 30% to the overall schedule is probably over padding it. You know, it could be that you only need to add 10% to the critical chain, and the rest of the time is going to be spent on those other branches.
Great. Maybe because we've discussed this, you and I, often, and I think you have because of your experience, you have a much clearer way of expressing it. The frontier between agile and critical chain when you have to choose. And I'm thinking of all the work where you do use agile a lot, for instance, in proof of concept. So you're not saying, critical chain is the answer. What is your question? You're saying you have to choose. And maybe you could explain why in the proof of concepts work you were doing in your career, you were using agile methodologies. Because, behind that question about a lot of uncertainty, it seems to me, if I've understood the point right and your point of view, that if there's huge uncertainty in terms of what needs to be done, the sequences and stuff, it might not be the right domain for critical chain.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, hopefully what came through in my presentation is that I'm methodology agnostic. I'm a firm believer that you should choose a methodology that's appropriate for the task at hand. And the reason I wanted to introduce critical chain is to remind people that although Agile is all the rage in IT now, it was developed for software where the uncertainty is extremely high and the relative value of requirements is widely variable. But there are activities where if you don't get 100% done, it's not a successful project. And in those cases, critical chain, I think, fills a gap. So hopefully what I've done is equip people with some notions that would help them decide whether to lean toward Agile or critical chain. If you look in the book, what you'll see is I acknowledge that there are people who actually combine the two. That's probably way beyond what we can talk about in this Q&A session, but it is possible to have a critical chain plan at the strategic level and then execute it operationally using the Agile method. So they're not, well, they're distinct, but they can be combined, I guess is the best way to say it. And to tie these remarks back in with what you were saying, Philip, about proofs of concept, I need to give a little bit of background. The last 5 years that I was working in the corporate environment actually was spent in corporate strategy. Now, I had worked previously in services and software organizations where I was dealing with projects and maybe a division, but eventually I wound up in corporate strategy where we looked across the entire corporation with all of its divisions that included hardware, software, and services. And we were given, I won't call it a unique mission because I'm not sure we were unique, but I will call it unusual. And that was, we were charged with strategy execution. And it's unusual to have that be assigned to a group in corporate strategy. What's more common is the corporate strategy group deals with acquisitions and divestitures and the allocation of budget to various divisions. And then as responsibility gets pushed down into the divisions, they do their own version of strategic planning for their software, their services, their hardware. So the execution gets pushed down in the organization and it winds up being pretty widely separated from the strategy and the execution of that strategy. What my group wound up doing was putting them together. So the way we did that was through proofs of concept. We looked for opportunities that would have generated new sources of revenue for the company, mostly, using technology that was, I'll call stable, not proven, but stable. So we weren't doing science projects, but we were doing projects where maybe we were first of a kind or second of a kind. And the goal was to use technology to solve business problems to the degree that the customer would look at that and say, wow, I love it. Let's go from proof of concept to full scale and use it in our day-to-day business. So my role as a corporate strategist was to execute projects, but before I executed them, I had to put on my hat that made me a venture capitalist. I had money to spend. I could invest in 90-day proofs of concept. And our goal was to have some demonstrable benefit within those 90 days. And in some cases, the proofs of concept lasted longer than 90 days. I think the longest one I did was a year and a half, but we had quarterly milestones to make sure that it was on track. And the reason I'm giving you this description is essentially we were doing Agile for strategy. And that's different from strategy as it refers to an Agile project. This was Agile at a corporate strategy level, meaning we made rapid decisions and rapid execution. So when we would come across an opportunity, I and my colleagues that were in this similar role to me would engage with potential project sponsors, and we would talk about customer requirements and the available technology. And we had a proposal template that we would force the project sponsors to complete and present. And from the time that they presented that proposal until we made a decision to proceed was 48 hours. We always made a decision within 2 days as to whether we were going to fund the proof of concept or not. Most of them we did fund, but that's because there was some work in the proposal preparation. I, as a venture capitalist, would work with the person who was the author of the proposal and steer them to the point where they were comfortable with what they were proposing, and I was comfortable that we could execute it. And so we had pretty high confidence when we went up to the review board that we would get approval for the funding, and then off we would go. Sometimes those proofs of concept rescued us from a competitive situation. Competitors were making claims that we believed were unfounded. And, it's one thing when a vendor says to a potential client, we dispute another vendor's claims. It's another thing when you just go out and prove it, And if a competitor claims that they can do 10 times what you can do and you prove that you can do 100 times what they can do, that's the end of the discussion. So, proofs of concept I found to be a very, very effective and interesting way to do corporate strategy. And it was economical too, in the sense that we spent a lot less doing those proofs of concept than the previous method had been in validating strategy. And that experience actually gave rise to the title of the book, Exceeding the Goal. We had the goal for 50% of our proofs of concept to be successful. Successful, not that the technology worked, because 100% of the time the technology worked. It was 50% of the time we were hoping the customers would buy. But we actually exceeded that goal by a pretty wide margin. We had over 80% acceptance on those proofs of concept. So it was a lot of reason to smile about that approach. So did that answer your question, Philip?
For me, certainly, yes. And as I say, it's it's easier maybe for it to be said by somebody else, but yourself, you as you say, your methodology and approach agnostic, and that's a beautiful example. I mean, for you, you fully understanding both what agile is and what the constraint management solutions are. You pick and choose according to the specific question or issue to be addressed, and that's a nice example. I'm torn with the number of questions and stuff, because I could go through the thread that we started here, and there's some questions about how to implement critical chain and that sort of stuff. But I'd like to pop back onto the one which triggered an avalanche of questions that I knew it would, which is your slide. Number 36. And about 5 or 6 people have asked, how does John Ricketts so calmly and coolly quantify scope? And I think I know, and just to give you my answer to that one, because I asked exactly the same question when I started seeing this sort of thing. The foundational answer is John's got a lot of experience in IT, because he can see things that common mortals can't. But anyway, you give your answer of how you calculate scope.
Actually, the best recommendation I can make there is to quantify it in terms of deliverables. So if you're delivering files or databases or screens, those are things that you can count. And the most robust measure of scope that I can think of is one where you've got countable objects. Where things get a little bit dicey is when you're trying to understand the internals. For example, when you look at computer code, there are operations within that code that do things like add numbers together or compare alphabetic characters. And then there are decisions taken based on those comparisons. And there are calculations that are done. You might add some numbers together. But the decision points in that code define its complexity. So if you've got code that's, let's say, 100 lines long, and it's got 10 decisions in it, and you compare that to program B, which is 1,000 lines long, and it has 100 decisions in it, program B is a lot more complex than program A. So just counting the countable objects is a good first step, but to the degree that you have insight into their internals, that equips you better. There's actually a metric for code complexity called the McCabe cyclomatic complexity number, which has been around for a long, long time. And the beauty of it is it's automatable. You can either write your own tool, or you can buy a tool that will read your code, and it will tell you what the cyclomatic complexity number is. Now, you're not going to know what that number is before the code's written, but it's something you can measure on past code. And then you can say to yourselves, okay, I know I'm going to have to do a system that's like another system, and I know what the cyclomatic complexity was on that other system. So we'll use that to indicate that the difficulty of writing this code is high, medium, or low, depending on what the number is. Where things get even dicier, though, is in the connection between programs, design complexity, so to speak. And this is one area where I think the IT field overall hasn't yet really come to recognize the implications of what they're doing. And what I mean by that is, if you go way back to the dawn of computing, when we developed systems monolithically, there weren't a lot of connections between things. That, you know, networks were rudimentary, and so you tended to write programs that ran on one machine. And you contrast that with what we've got today in cloud environments, where you may have many, many virtual machines running many, many programs, accessing many, many files, and application programming interfaces between the stuff that you've wrote and the stuff that other people wrote and maintain. Those interconnections are another source of complexity at the design level that I don't think is, people appreciate it at an intuitive level, but people don't quantify it. And I think if we had, and I'm speaking now as a field, if we had a standard way of quantifying the complexity of all these microservices that are running out there, what we would find is that the complexity that used to be inside the programs has migrated out into the interfaces. So I guess the best way to summarize it is start with countable objects, and to the degree that you can open up those boxes and look inside the black box and shine some light on it, that will give you more insight into the estimates that you need to attribute to scope.
Okay. As usual, Jack Vincent has got on the same subject, one which goes it's the same subject, one notch deeper. How does one normalize scope across many efforts? How does one compare screens with lines with whatever, with interface units or whatever?
Well, there was an effort undertaken back in, well, before the turn of the century, for something called function points.
Yep.
Which actually does quantify the things that I've alluded to, the countable deliverables. And it turns them into a single number in the aggregate. I'm not going to advocate function points here because there's no automated way to measure them. They have to be counted by human beings, and the fact that it's laborious means it's not something that's easily automated or generalizable. Now, there are organizations that have used function points successfully, and I believe they're still in use today, but it goes against the spirit of having automated measures that are usable in an IT environment to use function points. But if you're interested in one person's view of how you aggregate screens and reports and files and so forth, take a look at function points, and that'll show you what's been done historically. One of the things that you can do if you have the data is you can take a graph like the one that we're peering at on page 36 here, and instead of having a generic vertical axis like scope, you can actually put one of those other countable or measurable metrics on the vertical axis and look at the dispersion of points that way.
Thank you. Okay. That's how I tried to synthesize a number of questions that was on that one, which is indeed how can you quantify scope as you seem to be able to do so easily. And from having had many discussions about this with you, it's just I realized that you've seen so much of IT in various forms that you have this capacity of saying 3 screens equals 400 lines sort of thing.
Well, anyway. if I'm leaving you with the impression that it's easy, then I've done a disservice.
No, well, easy for you, or easier for you for less experience.
I'm saying it's possible, not that it's easy.
Well, yeah, and it's also you were saying it's not an exact science, right? But it's better to have an approximate estimate than no number at all. Now, going back to another bunch of questions, we've got from George. Should you not choose your best constraint within IT?
Should you choose your best constraint in IT? Absolutely. In fact, that's completely consistent with constraint management principles from other domains. But choosing it and getting it to where you want it to be are 2 different activities. In a manufacturing environment, you may decide that you want the constraint to be somewhere other than where it is today. And it could require $1 million investment to buy additional capacity for the machine that's the current constraint so that you coerce the constraint to be a different machine. So there's investment required. In the IT realm, it may also be the case that you need to make an investment. Back when the web was new, companies went through retraining to educate their developers on how to build applications that were web enabled, if not born on the web. And so when I think about IT, my base assumption going in is that the constraint is people, skills. Sometimes that's not the case, but that's my going in assumption. And so the good news about that is that with training and tools and experience, you can actually move the constraint. Although taking the example that I alluded to earlier when I was talking about the constraint management solution for resource management, IT architects are a precious commodity, and we could never hire enough of them. We wound up having to grow our own, which meant that we needed to have not just training, but we needed to have a career path that included on-the-job experience and mentoring to get people to the skill level that we needed to do the job. And IT architects were critical because they do the high-level design, and if you screw that up, then all the work you do to implement that design is going to be suboptimal. So great question, George. Thanks.
Yeah, and it's interesting because with other words, what you just described about the issue about IT architects, one finds in so many project portfolio environments, in product development, it's the systems engineer and all that sort of stuff, the people who can put all the bits together and keep have a good global view. Anyway, I'll shut up. The linked question from Ariane, wouldn't it be better not to go straight forward to the question about an IT constraint? Would it not be necessary to think at first whether the constraint is really within the IT area, and to have a control point, not to jump to the conclusion and search the solution only in the IT area? Constraint within IT or not? Is it elsewhere?
Well, yeah, I would agree that it doesn't make any sense to assume that the enterprise constraint is in IT. That's oftentimes alleged. We get told that we're a perpetual bottleneck. But if you really do your due diligence and look for where the enterprise constraint is, it may or may not be in IT. I will acknowledge that it can be in IT, but if it's in IT, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's hard to change. So your strategy, that difference between your as-is view today and your to-be view tomorrow could be to move the constraint out of IT. So that's not just possible, it's a very practical thing to do.
Okay.
Now, where things get a little dicey, though, is our acknowledgement earlier that for many organizations today, the constraint not only isn't in IT, it's actually out in the market. So one of the phenomena that occurred during the early days of constraint management implementations in manufacturing was everybody thought they had internal constraints. And once they implemented critical chain management or constraint management and the work in process melted away, the constraint flipped from internal to external fairly rapidly. And so I don't know what the current number is, Philip, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's north of 70% of enterprises today have an external constraint, meaning they can produce way more than the market will buy.
Mm-hmm.
Although, on that point, let's talk a little bit about the difference between a sales constraint and a market constraint. When we talk about external constraints, we mean the customer won't buy. And that sort of implies that the onus is on the customer. Why aren't they seeing the value in whatever product and service we have to offer? In fact, there's the possibility that the constraint exists internally in the sales organization. If we don't have enough salespeople to cover all the territories, or if they don't have the skills, they don't have the product and service knowledge to answer customers' questions, or their time is being frittered away on the telephone instead of actually being face-to-face with customers, which unfortunately is more often the case now that we're in the midst of a pandemic. All those are factors that may lead the constraint to be in the sales organization. But the good news is, if the sales organization is internal, we can do something about it. And so I just want to acknowledge here that when we talk about external constraints, when we leap to the conclusion that it's a customer won't buy problem, it might actually be a sellers can't sell problem. So back to you, Philip.
Yeah, I'd have a lot to add on that one. Another question now, which is from Dennis. What prerequisites do you consider necessary for the implementation of critical chain project management in IT?
Critical success factors for critical chain, huh?
Yeah.
Well, of course, you have to have a project manager who knows enough about the technique to be able to build a credible plan. But then you also have to have buy-in from the people that are going to execute that plan. If they don't understand why it's important to have a 50% estimate instead of a 90% estimate, you're going to get unnecessary padding, unnecessary contingency in the estimates. Even more importantly, though, among the people executing the project, you have to have a commitment to avoid bad multitasking and to follow the relay race rules and not get distracted. One of the ways that I've seen that done is people have a physical token. It might be a beach ball or something silly like that gets put on the desk of whoever's performing the current task on the critical chain. And it's a very visible signal to other people to leave that person alone because they're running as fast as they can to get their task done. Something else that's critical is to have buy-in from the project sponsors. So if the project sponsor doesn't understand how critical chain works, they're going to look at the project buffer and say, well, I don't want you to commit to the end of the buffer. I want you to commit to the beginning of the buffer, which if that happens, then that throws all the contingency out the window. So having mutual understanding amongst the project manager, the sponsor, and the people on the project is the key to success. Because at the end of the day, critical chain is just a set of rules and model behaviors for how you do projects. But it's pretty cool in the sense that it really does attack a constraint that the constraint's invisible in a critical path project. People tend to think it's the critical path, but it's really not. So, Philip, you want to jump in on this point? Because I know you've got a lot of experience.
No, actually, it's your webinar. I'll shut up. But everything you said was, I completely agree with the mascot thing about having some remarkable object that shows up the critical chain is a nice, simple, but very powerful one, which you mentioned. Good. I'm trying to get it to satisfy as many of these questions that we have, so I'll shut up. David Morales asked a question about implementing constraint management and I'll read it out. How often did you face resistance to change in implementing constraint management, and or how to apply WIP rules at the level of management, at the level of co-workers? And another question, similar question from him. How did you manage this? I mean, how do you deal with all the various resistance to change of these both common sense and counterintuitive ideas that we've been talking about?
It's a great question. I'm going to begin by telling you where you can go for a follow-up, and then I'll come back and answer the question in short form. If you look in the book, there's a section on the 6 steps for buy-in and the corresponding 6 levels of resistance. So that will give you a more detailed answer than what I can give you here. What I think I would rather do here is tell you 2 stories about where we had resistance. One of them we were able to overcome, and one we were not. We were frankly defeated. The first one that was a success was with resource management. In the organization that I was a part of, we had project managers and we had resource managers. So it was a matrix organization. The resource managers had people that could be assigned to projects, but it was the resource manager's job to, well, the way they were doing it in the beginning was they were hiring to plan. And like the old cartoon cliche where the character runs off the cliff and kind of hovers in there for a moment before they fall down into the canyon, that's what happened to our organization. We were hiring to plan, and the market went south, and we were left with huge overstaffing. And the solution to that was going to be pretty painful. So we introduced, it's called replenishment for services. That's the diagrams that you saw earlier in this webinar. And we did it by creating a simulator. We sat down with resource managers and we went through a hypothetical scenario of here's how the numbers look today. Here's how many people we've got, and here's what the plan is. And, you know, so what's your decision on how you would do hiring? We went through this exercise where they basically did their day job with pencil and paper. And then we redid the simulation with replenishment for services, which was hire to buffer or hire on demand instead of hire to plan. And what we showed them on with pencil and paper was that our solution outperformed their solution because it didn't run off that cliff. And it got us enough buy-in that they were willing to try it. And so we implemented hire to buffer. And over the next 6 months, we went from an oversupply condition to a balanced condition. We were able to ramp up and down as the market went up and down, and it was a success. The second story I'll tell about resistance to implementation actually involves critical chain. I had many different responsibilities over the years, but at one point in time, I was what was called a delivery excellence executive, which was corporate speak for I had responsibility over 3 different teams, and one of those teams was the project management top guns. These were the guys and gals who would go out and rescue troubled projects because they had preeminent project management skills. But in addition to rescuing troubled projects, another part of their mission was education. You know, it's far better to stay out of trouble than to get into trouble and have to be rescued. So they had a top 10 list of reasons that projects run into trouble. And here again, you can see that that list in the book if you're interested. And the list hasn't changed over the decades. So they would educate project managers about the pitfalls and hopefully help them avoid those pitfalls. We thought this was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And then came the keepers of the corporate methodology, which was based on critical path. And they didn't want to hear about critical chain at all. So we were stymied at that point. And we were less successful in implementing critical chain broadly than I think we deserved to be. We were able to implement it in local instances, but not as broadly based as I would have hoped. So there's two stories for you. The short answer to the question is, how do you counter resistance as you go through the buy-in steps? So back to you, Philip.
Yeah, I just complete that remark about you and critical chain. You were very much among the precursors, if not the precursor, with regards to implementing critical chain in IT. And what you didn't have with you, which people who would try to do it today, what you didn't have with you was the now fairly significant reference base with some beautiful, impressive results worldwide. I mean, the fact that the project of the year of the Project Management Institute with its 1 million members was awarded to Embraer last year for a critical chain development of a new airplane. You know, you didn't have that kind of big news to give greater visibility and credibility to critical chain. And now I think that anybody looking at critical chain, they often already have their competitor using it and stuff. So
it's much easier to be a fast follower than it is to be a pioneer.
Yeah, right. That's we'll summarize. So my experience with regards to resistance of critical chain in IT, it's no better or worse than critical chain in other essentially immaterial businesses of developing things, and it's moving ahead quite significantly, as long as you intelligently manage in a win-win configuration the agile approach and define correctly the frontiers between using critical chain and agile, or combining, as we often do, agile within critical chain.
In fairness to the vendors, we should probably mention that the software for creating and tracking critical chain projects is much improved now over what it was back in the day. Also, but I deliberately didn't lead with software because until you get the mindset right, the software doesn't matter. If you get the software right, then the software makes you much better.
Absolutely. So I'm going to now close down this little webinar, which is overrun by 40 minutes of fascinating questions and answers. My apologies to the few questions that we've left unanswered. But we got to the stage where for every question he answers, we get a new question coming in. So this will go on all night. We've noted the questions that we've left unanswered, and we'll see if we can get back to you in writing to answer the still open questions. Our apologies, but we have to close it down. Okay.
Yeah, these were great questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was really good. As John said in the introduction, because of this book, which you must not only buy, but you must read it, we're planning to do a lot of distribution of content in various forms, probably another webinar sometime, but also some standalone videos on a number of subjects to try and get all this extraordinary material across on this fundamental subject, which is, the coexistence of what for me are two important things, the digital or IT world and the theory of constraints. So you'll be hearing a lot more about all this throughout the year. It's one of our company objectives. Okay. And for those that want to see more webinars, and for those of you who speak Chinese, the next one is next week in Chinese. So please do join us. Not that I speak Chinese, it's going to be a simultaneous translation, but it's for that little part of the world called Asia next week. Okay. So Thank you, John, for preparing this and doing this. And John and I will be doing lots and lots of stuff to give you more content and ideas such as we did today. So thank you very much for your time, all of you. Very impressive to see still 100 people listening in after so long. But let's call it a day. And if you didn't find the answers in the webinar, buy the book. You might have noticed he even puts you what pages you have to read, depending on the slide, which is really cool. Okay, so mille merci to everybody, and see you around next time. Bye-bye.